we're going to use what we have just learned about imaginary numbers to solve some equations. So we have x squared plus 4 equals 0. We want to solve this for x, so we're going to start by subtracting 4 from both sides. So we get x squared equals negative 4. And then we're going to take the square root of both sides. Now remember, anytime you introduce the square root, your answer is going to be plus or minus. And then normally, always before, we said we couldn't take the square root of a negative number, but now we know we can. We just split it into the square root of 4 and the square root of negative 1. And our answer is going to be the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of negative 1 is I. Now, you don't need to show that last step, okay? If you are able to start doing these in your head, that's great. So plus or minus 2i. Okay, we're going to do the same thing over here. We're going to start by subtracting 49 from both sides. So we have x squared equals negative 49. We'll take the square root of both sides. Anytime you introduce the square root, you're going to need plus or minus. And so we get root 49 times root negative 1, so plus or minus 7i. All right, so let's take care of this next one. We're going to subtract 25 from both sides. So we get 9x squared equals 25. And let's go ahead and divide both sides by 9. So 25 ninths. And we're going to take the square root of both sides. Oh, wait, someone forgot the negative. Sorry about that. There it is. All right, anytime you introduce the square root, it's plus or minus. And this is the same thing as the square root of 25 ninths times the square root of negative 1, because there is a negative there that I forgot to write the first time. So the square root of 25 ninths, just take the square root of the top and bottom. That is 5/3. And the square root of negative 1 is I. So plus or minus 5/3 I. The last thing I want to point out to you is raising I to a power. We don't do this a whole lot, but this is definitely something on the ACT that you might see come up. They might just throw a question on here with I's and you'll know what to do. So when we're raising these to powers, I to the 0 power, well, anything to the 0 power is just 1. I to the first is just I, of course, and we know that I squared is negative 1. Okay, so we already know those. I cubed, well, that's the same thing as I squared times I to the first. And I squared is negative 1, so this is going to be negative 1 I to the first, or negative I. Okay, let's take a look at I to the fourth. I to the fourth is the same thing as I squared times I squared. And I squared are both negative 1, and negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. I to the fifth, well, that would be I squared times I squared times I to the first. I squared times I squared is negative 1 times negative 1, so that's going to be positive 1 times I. I to the sixth will just be I squared times I squared times I squared, which is negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1, which is negative 1. And I to the seventh will be I squared times I squared times I squared times I to the first. So negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1, which is negative I. Now, if all of this stuff hasn't made a lot of sense to you, that's okay. I want you to notice these numbers that I've written down, not this stuff. We don't need those really. I want you to notice that we've got a little pattern going on here. Okay. We have 1i, negative 1, negative I. 1i, negative 1, negative I. So I to the 8th is going to be 1. I to the 9th is I. I to the 10th is negative 1. And I to the 11th is negative I. And if you go to I to the 12th, I to the 13th, so on and so forth, this pattern is just going to keep repeating. And it repeats in the cycle forever, okay? It repeats in these cycles of 4. So what you're going to do is all you need to learn is this first column. Okay, I to the 0 is 1, which is obvious. I to the first is I, which is obvious. So all you really need to remember is I squared is negative 1 and I to the cubed is negative I. The shortcut is any power, like let's say we decided to do I to the 37th power, just because. You're going to take that 37, you're going to divide by 4 and find the remainder. Okay, so let me show you how this works. We're going to take 37 and we're going to divide it by 4. And we're actually going to do this by hand. You can do it by hand. It's no big deal. 4 goes into 37 9 times, which I don't actually care about, with a remainder of 1. Okay, so what that tells us is to get to I to the 37th, we've gone through this cycle 9 times with a remainder of 1. So I to the 37th is the same thing as I to the 1st, which is just plain old I. So let me show you another one just for fun. Let's do I to the 126th, just because. So to find that, we're going to take 126 and divide it by 4. So 4 goes into 12 3 times. Drop the 6. 4 goes into 6 once. So what this is telling us is we've gone through this cycle 31 times. We don't care about that. What we do care about is the remainder. This is the same thing as I squared, and I squared is -1. So like I said, in this class, we don't deal with that particular problem very often, but might be something that pops up on the ACT.